Watching Channel 11 News at 4.
With the first cries of gold in the Klondike, the city of Seattle was forever linked with the Canadian Yukon.
100 years later, Seattle still has connections, and that includes one of our leading retailers. Perry Cooper joins us now with his special report on Seattle's gold rush.
Well, that first connection came down from Alaska. It was the SS Portland. It docked in Elliott Bay on July 17, 1897, and word spread across the world about a ton of gold on board, and plenty more where that came from. In hours, Seattle became the jump-off point for a gold rush bigger than the one in California.
We find ordinary people making extraordinary fortunes, and all it was luck. It was magic.
One of the first down with gold was a hometown man, T.S. Lippy, the secretary of the Seattle YMCA.
Not a life of great luck up until the time he went north. He went north and he struck it rich and he brought home hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Almost overnight, the town was awash with gold.
And the docks were jammed with boats, loaded with optimistic gold seekers, barely understanding what they would soon face in the Klondike.
By the 1st of August, every hotel room in Seattle was filled. And by September 1st, over 9,000 people had left Seattle for the gold fields in Alaska.
Anything that would float arrived in Seattle, boasting passage to the Klondike. A trip that cost $200 before now ran as much as $1,000. And on the street, $500 bonuses were given to get a ticket.
As far as anyone could see, the only difference was that the first-class passengers slept with the horses and the second-class passengers slept with the mules. John W. Nordstrom.
One of those struck with Klondike fever was a logger and miner who had just immigrated from Sweden. The soon-to-be founder of his own retail shoe store, John W. Nordstrom.
The boat was terribly overloaded, carrying 1,200 men, 600 horses, and 600 mules.
The boat ride proved to be the easiest part of the rush to the Klondike. Once reaching Alaska, miners had to traverse the snow-covered Chilkoot or White Pass. With a required year of supplies needed, it took as many as 20 trips. Then, after building a boat from nearby trees, came a 300-mile river trip with rapids crashing over the deck.
It was getting so cold by this time that we were afraid the river would freeze before we reached Dawson. So we pushed on as fast as possible, knowing we had no time to spare. And as we rode along in our boat, large chunks of ice floated past us all day.
Dawson City became one of the largest cities on the West Coast overnight, while businessmen charged as much as 1,000% markups for things like eggs. Nordstrom was like many, finding nothing in his first 4 efforts.
As the ground was frozen, I had to build a fire to thaw it out so I could break the ground. It took me 10 days to dig down 25 feet to bedrock.
After 2 years, Nordstrom found a small amount of gold, but like many others, found his claim had been improperly sold. Settling through a lawsuit, he came home with $13,000. Part of it was invested with another Klondike miner, Carl Wallen, who opened a shoe store at 4th and Pike. Wallen and Nordstrom. Now, you might think, what a lucky move for Nordstrom, who started the store that's evolved into what it is today. But Nordstrom actually found out a few years later that the claim he settled turned out $2 million in gold over the next year, and eventually netted about $5 million before it was sold to a dredging company. So it could have been even bigger.
Yeah. Well, they made their millions later.
He's still okay.
Yeah, he's doing okay. Perry, how many people actually came back with gold?
Well, about 100,000 they figure in that first year came to Seattle and went up north. About 40,000 didn't even get out of Seattle because they found out it was too expensive and couldn't make it from here. 40,000 went up to the Klondike gold fields. About 4,000 they figure made it. And only about a couple of dozen actually hit gold for millions. About 4,000 hit gold, and about a couple of dozen got millions out of it. So
made some riches.
Yeah, there was not a lot of people who really struck it.
Not that I'm planning on heading up there anytime soon, but are they still mining in that area?
Actually, yes, they are. In fact, they are still mining the very original Klondike claims that were mined over and over back in the 1800s. They've been doing them over and over about a dozen times. There's new technology, in fact, that's actually been created over the last 10 years that's creating a new boom. And they've even found gold in the tailings that was left by those 1880 miners, which is the stuff that they threw out after they found the original gold nuggets.
Huh, I guess with new technology or something, they're able to.
Yeah, they were able to find a little bit smaller stuff.
Are they finally, after all these years, running out of gold?
If you can believe it, no. They are actually at the end of some of the veins that they have found in the original claims back in the 1880s. They're still actually mining several of those now, but they figure there are spots throughout the Yukon out there that still have gold and have yet to be even tried.
Wow.
There's still gold in them.
You can still go up there. Feel free.
Or maybe that's your next series. Perry goes
give it a
searching.
shot.
Yeah, it goes gold
I might
mining.
not come back from that one, though.
Take your money and run, huh?
right.
Thanks, Perry.
When people talk about founding fathers who helped build the city of Seattle, names like Denny, Gessler, and Mercer come to mind.
But there's another name you won't recognize, a man who helped to turn Seattle into more than just a simple boom town. Perry Cooper is joining us now with more of his special report on Seattle's gold rush.
Santa Monica, this happened to come in a perfect opportunity for this man, the gold rush, the Klondike gold rush of 1897. He also had to compete with the likes of big city San Francisco and rising Portland. His efforts helped turn Seattle in 10 years from a city of 60,000 to 230,000. On the horizon, Seattle's future appeared going up in smoke as the 1890s began. The Great Fire of 1889 in one sweep nearly leveled the entire city. Then 4 years later, hit the Depression of 1893, ready to make Seattle and the entire region just another set of busted boom towns. Along Puget Sound, it was said, many were reduced to living on the clams they could dig from the sands of the beaches. The arrival of the SS Portland changed that overnight with its cargo of a ton of gold. In 2 weeks, every Seattle hotel was filled. Business jumped 50%, and 9,000 prospectors left for the north. Soon, Seattle would be forever connected to the north, pointed as the place you had to go to reach the Klondike. Thanks to the public relations director of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, Erastus Brainerd.
And he's such an unassuming looking person, but he was just brilliant in creating a manipulative and an insightful and inspired public relations program.
The former newspaper man used any means to blanket the country. He punched out letters to every state governor, and his staff contacted the mayor of every town of 5,000 or more. He wrote information booklets similar to these with the latest and reliable maps of the Klondike, always mentioning Seattle as the takeoff point. Copies of the PI filled libraries, post offices, and even Christmas cards to kings in Europe. Then he would find young miners awaiting boats north and write letters for them.
People didn't know anything about where they were going, so he could tell them almost anything and they'd probably believe it. And he'd put the guy's name at the bottom and send it back to his hometown newspaper. So he had all these papers in the country publishing his version of the gold rush.
The key actually came from the north, in the Klondike. But for Seattle, it wasn't the gold.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, fearing starvation, required that everybody buy a year's worth of supplies. And they knew that's where the money was.
Each miner had to outfit themselves with about $500 of supplies. Seattle businesses took advantage. Outfitters piled their inventory on the sidewalks, and Brainerd brought in the customers.
Brainerd's ability to market the city of Seattle as the one point of departure, the one portal through which you had to go to the Klondike.
Due to Brainerd, an estimated 80% of Klondike business came through Seattle. By the first spring, it totaled $25 million. Brainerd tried his own hand up north, but failed. He came back later as an editor of the PI, but when he died at 67 in 1922, he never profited from the golden wave he helped create.
And that wave had nothing to do with Seattle people going north and striking it rich. Rather, it had to do with Seattle people staying right where they were and getting rich right here, mining the hopeful miners.
One interpretation has traced Seattle's successful business history back to those 1897 days, calling it the Klondike Theory. In fact, Economist magazine says it was through the gold rush that Seattle learned the marketing flair it now applies to selling computer software or persuading people to pay $3 for a cup of coffee. That, of course, is their words, not mine.
This is just where the Klondike bar came from, too, maybe.
All in the marketing. All these thousands of people that came through Seattle must have liked what they saw here, too.
And that's one thing a lot of people forget, is that a lot of people, even though they were just heading towards the Yukon, a lot of them ended up staying here because once they got to Seattle, up to as many as 40,000 found out it was too expensive or they didn't have enough money or enough goods to get all the way up to the Yukon. And a lot of those people settled here in Seattle. And then also all those people coming back from the mines, whether they struck it rich or not, came back through Seattle, and many of them settled here as well, too.
And so tomorrow we take a look at
some of those businesses that started from the very beginning, and also how some of that money was spent all the way around Seattle.
All right.
Thanks, Perry.
You're watching Channel 11 News at 4.
There are more than a handful of reminders still around from Seattle's participation in the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush.
They include not only businesses, but also investments that literally pulled the city out of the depths of depression. Perry Cooper joins us this afternoon to wrap up his special series, Seattle's Gold Rush.
Taylor Michael, when you think of the gold rush, most of the time you just think about the gold and the money that people found. But all of that money had to go somewhere as well. Fortunately for a budding city of Seattle, many of those suddenly rich miners began spending their loot by opening new businesses and remaking Seattle. Boeing's Red Barn stands as a reminder of the company's 1916 beginnings. Its windows reflect the flight of the business's progress. Boeing, along with examples like Microsoft, Nordstrom, and Starbucks, have given Seattle a reputation of independent, risk-taking entrepreneurs. One theory says all of Seattle business can trace their beginnings back 100 years to the enterprising gamblers of the gold rush.
And it seemed as if the city was prepared for something, and they didn't know what they were prepared for.
What it was the most incredible commercial windfall the city had ever seen. Sales in 3 years went from $300,000 to $10 million. Cooper and Levy, then located just off Yesler, became one of the main Klondike outfitters. Eventually, they were bought out by the Bon Marché.
The company began to build tents for prospectors. That was its sole purpose.
Today, Rainier Industries is a combination of Puget Sound Tent and Duck and Seattle Tent and Awning. Both started making bunting and awnings for Seattle storefronts and creating Alaska's tent cities.
Many of them were made out of very poor fabrics, untreated fabrics, so their life was short. The tents may have only lasted 1 year, 1 season. The fabrics would mold because they didn't have chemicals to preserve them.
The red plaid cruiser jackets, still made by C.C. Filson Company, were virtually the uniform of the 1897 Klondike miner.
It was something that people who primarily used it never left it. And these are the people that it grew on.
Clinton Filson opened his business the summer of the gold rush, and the company's label still bears witness to their origins.
The after effects of it have little to do with gold in a way. It was wealth and prosperity and a good solid base from which to build a big city.
$200 million of gold passed through the Seattle Assay Office in just 10 years. An estimated $100 million was spent and invested in Seattle.
I was delighted to find these two photographs.
Seattle's train depot is one civic example. Previously just a standing roof on the waterfront, the ornate Union Station replaced it in 1912. Several buildings in Pioneer Square still exist that were the result of Klondike investments. The T.S. Lippy building came from the YMCA secretary that struck gold. And all that money had to be spent. The new millionaires spent lavishly, some wasting their fortunes. But it opened new business for luxury items.
What's rather interesting, a piano like this probably sold for about $150.
San Francisco-based Sherman Clay opened its first Seattle store as a product of the gold rush. Pianos were the era's main source of entertainment.
It was almost like a mandatory thing. In fact, as if a daughter did not have piano, it was very, very difficult for her to have a husband.
If you'd like to get more information on the Klondike Gold Rush, there are plenty of opportunities during the centennial year. The Museum of History and Industry has a Klondike exhibit going on right now. The Washington State History Museum will open an exhibit later this summer. Centennial events will be going on all summer, including a reenactment of that arrival of the Ton of Gold ship in July. And if you haven't been there yet, get out to the Klondike Gold Rush National Park in Pioneer Square. And I also want to thank as well my photographer Jeffrey Nelson, did a great job with the pictures for this, and my editor Kevin Glantz, who put this together and make it a wonderful series for us.
All did a very good job.
Thank you.
Why is it that the Klondike was so rich in gold to begin with?
That was one of the questions I had to begin with, which was why all of this stuff is still there and continue to be golding. It's because the area was not glaciated, which means the glaciers didn't go out and scour all of the river bottoms like everywhere else in North America and spread out all that gold into various places. That gold is made up into riverbeds to begin with, and it was not washed away. And in fact, some of the biggest deposits were actually found in the old ancient riverbeds, not along the rivers that were there at the time in the 1800s, but some further off to the side of them because the rivers had moved due to earth movements from all those years.
Interesting.
Good stuff. Thanks a lot, Perry.